One of the most popular games on earth and running almost every day on hundreds of sport channels, football is a classy game that caught up with impulsive fame in the past 4 decades or so. But have you ever thought about when, or how, football first originating? Let's explore how football developed and spread over the years. Some suggest that the history of football dates back as far as 2500 BC. During this time, the Greeks, Egyptians, and Chinese all appear to have partaken in games involving a ball and feet. Most of these games included the use of hands, feet, and even sticks to control a ball. The Roman game of harpastum was a possession-based ball game in which each side would attempt to retain possession of a small ball for as long as possible. The ancient Greeks competed in a similar game entitled episkairos. Both of these pursuits reflected rules closer to rugby than modern-day football. The most relevant of these ancient games to our modern-day association football is the Chinese game of tsushu, suchu or kuju, meaning kicking the ball. Records of the game began during the Han Dynasty, 206 BC to 220 AD, and it may have been a training exercise for soldiers. The Chinese game of suchu or kuju is recognized as an ancient form of football. Tsushu involved kicking a small leather ball into a net strung between 2 bamboo poles. The use of hands was not permitted, but a player could use his feet and other parts of his body. The main difference between tsushu and football was the height of the goal, which hung about 30 feet from the ground. From the introduction of tsushu onwards, football-like games spread throughout the world. Many cultures had activities that centered on the use of their feet, including Japan's kemari, which is still played today. The Native Americans had pasaherman, the indigenous Australians played marngrook, and the Maoris had kiorahi, to name a few. Football began to evolve in modern Europe from the medieval period onwards. Somewhere around the 9th century, entire towns in England would kick a pig's bladder from one landmark to another. The game was often seen as a nuisance and was even banned during some periods of Britain's history. Various forms of what is now known as folk football were played. Some of the British games pitted 2 massive and rather mob-like teams against one another. These could stretch from one end of a town to the other, with both teams trying to get the ball into their opponent's goal. It's said that the games were often low-scoring. Standard rules were not enforced, so almost anything was allowed and play often became quite violent. Shrove Tuesday often saw the biggest games of the year and most matches were a big social event. As the country industrialized, the space limitations of the cities and less leisure time for workers saw a decline in folk football. This was partially attributed to legal concerns over the violence as well. Versions of folk football were also played in Germany, Italy, France, and other European countries. The codification of football began in the public schools of Britain at the beginning of the 19th century. Within the private school system, football was a game in which the hands were used during periods of play and grappling allowed, but otherwise, the modern shape of football was being formed. 2 barless goals were placed at each end, goalkeepers and tactics were introduced, and high tackles outlawed. Yet, the rules varied greatly, some resembled the play of rugby, while others preferred kicking and dribbling. Space restraints did cool the game down from its violent origins. The rules and regulations continued to evolve in Britain, and by the 1800s dedicated football clubs at schools began to emerge. Again, even in its semi-organized form, the rules stretched from rugby to modern football. Players often tripped each other, and kicking an opponent in the shins was only frowned upon when he was being held. Over the years, schools began playing matches against one another. During this time, players were still allowed to use their hands and were only permitted to pass the ball backward, as in rugby. In 1848, the Cambridge rules were established at Cambridge University. While this allowed students to move up in the ranks as they graduated and adult football clubs became more common, players could continue to handle the ball. There was still quite some way to go in producing the modern game of football we see today. The 1872 association football match between the national teams of Scotland and England was the first ever official international. It took place on November 30, 1872 at Hamilton Crescent, the West of Scotland Cricket Club's ground in Partick, Glasgow. The match was watched by 4,000 spectators and finished as a 0-0 draw. Other divisions were formed, including the Football League in 1888 in the North and Midlands of the country, and the first Championship League games were played. According to FA rules, players must remain amateurs and not receive pay. This became an issue in the 1870s when a few clubs charged admission to spectators. Players were obviously not happy and demanded compensation for their training and game time. As the popularity of the sport grew, so did spectators and revenue. Eventually, clubs decided to begin paying and football turned into a professional sport. It did not take long for other European countries to adopt the British love for football. Leagues began popping up throughout the world, the Netherlands and Denmark in 1889, Argentina in 1893, Chile, in 1895, Switzerland and Belgium, in 1895, Italy, in 1898, Germany and Uruguay, in 1900, Hungary, in 1901, and Finland, in 1907. It was not until 1903 that France formed their league, even though they had adopted the British sport long before. The International Federation of Association Football, FIFA, was formed in Paris in 1904 with 7 members. This included Belgium, Denmark, France, the Netherlands, Spain, Sweden, and Switzerland. Germany announced its intention to join the same day. In 1930, the first ever FIFA World Cup was held in Uruguay. There were 41 members of FIFA at the time, and it has remained the pinnacle of the football world ever since. Today it boasts over 200 members, and the World Cup is one of the biggest events of the year. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like and hit the subscription button. Thanks for watching, see you next time.